On this inside line, I'm going over everything that I did to modify my Gladiator in a way that it could run these 40-inch tall tires without worry on the trail. All right, let's get to it. If you've followed our channel for a while, you know that over the past year and a half, I've progressed my Gladiator build a little at a time, all in an effort to make it a more capable and versatile Jeep for my needs. With a 137-inch wheelbase and a less than ideal departure angle, I've constantly looked for ways to compensate for these shortcomings without robbing what I think are excellent on-road manners and a really practical platform overall. The biggest improvement I've made up to this point has been the addition of a 3-inch JKS manufacturing suspension system along with a set of 37-inch tall Nitto trail grapplers. Both made a huge difference on-road and off with the performance of the Jeep and really with the ground clearance improvements that I saw on the trail. Now, that being said, I still knew it could be better. So I decided to split my Rubicon flares to give me enough room to make the huge leap up to a 40-inch tall tire. And huge difference it is. To the left is the original set of 285s that came off the Gladiator originally, and to my right is my new 40 by 1350 R17 Nitto Trail Grappler. Now, obviously there is a massive size and weight difference here between what the Jeep was originally intended for and what I'm now wanting to put on it. Now, there's another big difference that you may notice. This has a 5-lug bolt pattern and this has a 8-lug bolt pattern. And there's a big reason for that. So let's dive into just why more lugs is better and why I'm moving from a semi-float axle to a full float axle. Okay, so first off, go ahead and laugh at my diagram, but I think it's going to be helpful. Now, the thing you need to know is all Gladiators, no matter if it's a Rubicon, Mojave, a Sport, or Overland, come with a high pinion 44 front and a low pinion 44 rear. These are these next generation or third generation Dana 44 axles, and they're really not bad from the factory. And in my opinion, if you're only going to run up to a 37-inch tall tire and you're easy on how you drive it, I think it's a perfectly fine axle to keep under the vehicle. The big drawbacks of these axles really are two main things. Number one, they reintroduced the front axle disconnect when they made the JL platform, and eventually that axle moved over to the JT. And that's this big cast housing that allows the passenger side on the differential side to become disengaged. It's supposed to help with a little bit of fuel economy, but it's just a notoriously weak part of an axle, and I'm sure if any of you have researched the web, you've seen a few axles that look like big smiley faces where people have either hit them or they've had damage and it's broke. So that's a weak point. The other challenge with these axles is they're semi-float, which is super common in a mid-sized truck. Even your F-150 is going to have a semi-float axle design. So that in and of itself is not a bad thing when paired with a stock size tire. The issue is, and it's primarily we see it in the rear more than we do in the front, is this is a semi-float rear axle. And what ends up happening is you have the flange here, these are your studs in purple, and when your wheel is bolted up here, especially if you have, let's say, a different back spacing from the factory, so you spaced it out a little bit more, now you've got a much larger tire, it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on this flange. And now in a semi-float axle design, you have one single bearing at the axle end that is supporting not only this axle shaft, so it's keeping it isolated in place, but it's supporting the weight of the vehicle. There's just one bearing doing a lot of work. And what we typically see happens is that the flange will become bent when you run even a 37-inch tall tire. If you hit stuff hard enough, or if you find that you're overloading the Jeep and it takes a good hit, that is maybe the number one culprit, number one sort of problem with a semi-float axle design is a bent flange. Now up front with a semi-float axle, and what's common in the JT is you have a unit bearing. So you have two bearings that are kind of tightly spaced together, and you have your spline on the inside of the bearing. So it's an all-in-one assembly. Your studs are mounted to it. But the issue that we found over the years is when you have your bearings so tight next to each other and you offset your tire and you have a much larger tire than stock, you start to wear out these bearings. The other problem is the same as the rear, in that the axle shaft up front is always turning. So even though you're not putting power and you're not engaged in four-wheel drive, your front end of your vehicle is always turning, and it's one of the reasons that if you do break an axle shaft or you have an issue off-road, it's a bigger deal. You really have to go in and do much more work to get off the trail. And that's where kind of the full float draw comes in. In a full float configuration, you use a spindle design, and you use two bearings that separates much more than a unit bearing. Your studs move back quite considerably, and so the load of the wheel and the tire is much different than how it is on a standard unit bearing. The other big draw in terms of the front is you have a selectable hub, and this is going to give you the ability to engage that axle shaft or disengage it. So if you do happen to break it, you just disengage it and nothing is spinning up front. This is also a huge benefit for when you're driving down the road, so you no longer have your front drive shaft spinning, differential, so you're getting rid of a lot of parasitic loss. Now out back, this is even more important, as just like in the front where you have two bearings separating that load so it can handle additional weight, but you have separated the axle shaft itself, and so it's going to bolt to this hub assembly, and then you'll have your shaft that's completely separated. And the idea of the full float design here is that the axle shaft doesn't have to share or bear any of the weight of the vehicle. All it's doing is propelling, and all of your weight is on this hub assembly here. And again, as you have your bearings spread out, it's helping with the forces, and depending on how your flange is mounted on the hub assembly, typically you won't have as much of that leverage from the tire because of how the assembly is put together. So I think it's worth mentioning at this point, before the comments get crazy, that yes, I'm aware that some people run 40s on semi-float axles, and I'm not here to criticize anybody that does that. All I can say is what my experience is and bring that to this table and channel. And realistically, over the past 20 years, I've done multiple Ultimate Adventure trips, JK experience trips, JL experience trips, and tons of trail rides all across America. And what I have found more typically than not is that if you are going to run a 40-inch tall tire or larger, you benefit greatly from putting in some sort of full float, whether it be a 60 series axle, a 14 bolt, an 80 series axle, something that can handle not only the weight but the horsepower and really hard driving that is often associated with having this big tire. Now, what axle did I go with? Well, I picked one that I thought gave me, I guess it's weird to say the best bang for your buck, but it had the most features. And so it's a complete axle package designed to bolt in 100%, so no weirdness with ABS sensors, no fabrication, no nothing. And they come from a company called Dynatrac, which is an American axle manufacturer that's been doing this for 30 plus years. And this is their Hardcore Plus package. So it gives you a ProRock XD60 front, so it's a 60 series high pinion front differential, and you have a ProRock XD60 rear. Now the rear is a low pinion, which is what you want in an application like this, where you're gonna have a lot of weight and you want that strength on that drive side of the gear. I'm kind of building for this thing of where I want to go, not necessarily where I am. So it being a full float axle, low pinion rear, gives me options. So if I ever want to up the horsepower of this thing, up the weight, anything like that, I'm kind of, you know, buy once, cry once here. This is the axle set that will be with this Jeep. Now, I opted to have my axles shipped to Low Range 4x4 here in Wilmington, North Carolina. Given the massive crate they ship in, it made it much easier to have a forklift on hand to move the axles around. Now, there were a few reasons why I opted for Dynatrac over other axle manufacturers, and maybe the biggest has to do with ground clearance. Now, Dynatrac boasts the highest ground clearance of any other 60 based axle on the market. Now what this really means for wheeling is that I'm not going to be banging around on my diff off-road, which is a huge deal. This 60 series housing has specific oiling features and allows you to run the big Super 60 10.1 inch ring gear. So all of that is going to be stronger than your basic junkyard 60. But the big thing here is not only do you get this super high clearance housing, but it's also smooth on the bottom. This is for both the front and rear differential. And if you've compared this to any pull out junkyard axle that has fins on the bottom, this is going to mean that I'm not going to be hung up as much off-road, which ultimately means I'm going to have an easier time sliding over obstacles if my differential happens to hit on the trail. While thicker axle brackets do add strength, it also adds weight. In order to offset some of this with the front axle, Dynatrac uses a 3 3/4 inch lightweight axle tube. Now this tube is said to give you the highest strength to weight ratio of any other light truck axle on the market. Now out back, Dynatrac uses 4-inch axle tubes along with 7/16 cover bolts, which actually adds additional structure to the housing. Now something that was very important to me was to make sure that this Jeep could drive easy on the road. And Dynatrac was one of the only companies that I had found that had spent a lot of time with what's called the Ackerman angle and figuring out how to reduce scrub radius and make the Jeep drive better than factory. And the way they accomplish this is they make their own 1550 steering knuckles. Now this knuckle is not only designed to give you better handling, but it really has a lot of off-road features that are unique to Dynatrac. One of those being that it actually raises the location of the tie rod so you don't have to worry about hitting it as much off-road. Now another big deal here is that it allows room for a 1550 U-joint, which is absolutely massive. And when you use it with Dynatrac's 35 spline heat-treated and forged axle shafts, you have 50 degrees of turning. Now to get the axles under the Jeep, I had some help from my friends at Low Range. With a few helping hands, we were able to get the stock axles completely removed along with the drive lines in just a few hours. Now it's worth noting that unfortunately due to COVID, not all of my parts were able to get to the shop at the same time, so you'll sort of see me float between the shop and my house. We wanted to go ahead and at least get the axles bolted in, so that's what we boogied through initially. We knew we'd be keeping the shocks in place and the coil, so that wasn't a big deal. Now once we got the Jeep back in the air, we went ahead and locked down the rear coils. They actually have a bolt down feature in the back that keeps the coil securely in place. From there, we were able to go ahead and reuse the stock brake lines in the back and just simply plug in the tone ring sensor and bolt it in just like it was factory. Another suspension bit that carried over was the 2-inch bump stop landing pad, which I have found has been more than enough for the 40s with my trim fenders. Now, if you're running a stock sway bar like I am in the rear, Dynatrac sends these brackets that actually raises the bar up. The nice thing about this, it actually kind of gives you a little bit more ground clearance, but it does sweep the links back just a little bit. I'll talk to you more about that in just a minute. Now I'm running a 538 differential gear, which is perfect for these 40s, and it is paired with an Eaton e-locker. Now, in terms of wiring up the lockers, I purchased a kit from Z Automotive. This is a little harness that goes in between your factory wiring and the differential, which allows me to use my stock Rubicon locker controls. Now these axles also come with a e-brake setup that bolts directly to the axle housing. It uses a bracket that goes on the upper control arm to actually guide the cable. On the passenger side, you'll route it over the gas tank, and it'll just drop over the frame on the driver's side. Zip tie these things in place and you really won't have an issue. Now, to access the e-brake on the inside of the cab, you have 2 bolts on each side of the center console, and to raise it up so I can actually get my hand in there, I just ratchet strapped over the sound bar and brought it up, made it super simple. Once you route your cables through the floor, you'll simply attach them to the factory bracket, and then you'll have to go in and keep tightening until you get the adjustment right. Basically, you'll get out and do this a handful of times until you have e-brake that's you're satisfied with. It took me a few times to get this right. Thank goodness I have little arms. I can get in there and make that happen. Now, from here, went ahead and just tossed the differential in with the arms that were already there. So that's my stock uppers and fixed lowers. I knew I was going to have to do some adjustment later. Not a big deal. You do have to remove the front calipers so you can install the factory tone rings, and then after that you bolt everything back in place. There are spots for the factory front brake lines, so you can just bolt those in. I'm still running my stock brake lines as I'm recording this. I will end up most likely getting an aftermarket set. Going back to that sway bar that was kicked at an angle, one of the things that I found, and Dynatrac says that you might have to modify your exhaust depending on your sway bar configuration. Mine was hitting, and so I went ahead and did something I've been wanting to do for a while, which is remove the factory resonator in the back. Did a quick cut at the shop and went back and cleaned it up a little bit later. Now, Dynatrac actually shapes its diff cover so you can get as much up travel as possible. I'm using about 3.5 inches of stackable bump that I picked up from Dynatrac, and to dial in the axle placement perfectly, I got a set of upper and lower adjustable control arms from JKS Manufacturing. Now, the lowers are 2-inch OD, 250 wall DOM tubing. You get a flex joint at one end with 30 degrees of misalignment, and then you've got a durable rubber bushing that is basically OE spec that's going to go at the axle side. I've been really happy with these things so far. No squeaks, no obnoxious noises, anything like that. And really, it's really a big deal to be able to dial this front axle in, not only to get the caster right, which Dynatrac recommends around 7 degrees, but again, for cycling this axle with 40s and making sure that I could get the most up travel and it was exactly where it needed to be, I really needed the upper and lower control arms up front. Now out back, what I ended up finding was not only did I have a bent stock lower control arm, which I knew I had tagged off-road, I just didn't realize it was so bad, but I also needed to dial in the rear suspension, not so much for wheelbase, but more so for dialing in the pinion angle. Again, 2-inch OD wall, quarter wall tubing, crazy heavy duty. All 4 control arms are adjustable with big flex joints and rubber bushings at the other end. And it's worth mentioning, but I will get into it more, that my axles are built at 72.5 inches wide. That is an optional width. Standard is 68.5. I had already made sure that the rear 40 was going to clear fine, and it did. But up front, I saw that I was rubbing on the front bumper and on the back side of the Rubicon rock rail. So the front bumper wasn't a big deal. I ended up taking off about a 1/2 inch on each side. So far that's working pretty good. The rock rails actually unbolted entirely from the Jeep and ended up cutting a couple inches off of them. I cut it straight so I could recap it, put a little paint on there, and that's been fine. So just wanted to make sure that I could cycle this before I got it out on the trail, and would learn the hard way that it was going to be hitting one way or the other. With this setup so far, it's been really good. Now, to actually get this thing driving, of course, I needed new drive lines. I called JE Reel. I've been using JE Reel drive lines for years, and they're a straight shooter company. And I said, listen, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm building the Jeep for. And they definitely told me they could build me a one-piece drive shaft, but they knew that I liked a wheel. And they said, if you're really going to take this thing on trails, don't do the one piece. And they had actually sent me some photos of a one-piece drive shaft that had just got torn to pieces, and the guy came to them and said, listen, this can't keep happening. I need to do something better. So that's why they recommend doing the 2-piece. You get more clearance out of it. Their 2-piece uses a unique carrier bearing that addresses really 2 things. Number one, it gets it in line. From the factory, the stock carrier bearing is actually offset just a little bit. This makes it in line with the transfer case. And the other big deal here is it sets up with a fairly large style bearing that gives you the ability to have this giant 1350 double carbon joint, which is more than enough. I have 1350 yokes at the axle. They bolted right into my ProRocks. That wasn't a big deal. They sent me new yokes for my transfer case, and those are 1350 as well. Up front, same thing, double carbon 1350 CV at the transfer case end, 1350 at the front. Got plenty of travel. You know, this setup can grow with me. As I mentioned, I went with 72.5-inch wide axles, and the reason I wanted to do that is I knew it would give me the ability to run a 5.5-inch backspaced wheel. Now this wheel is a beadlock. It comes from Trail Ready, and there are a lot of great beadlock options out there, and this was one of those things where I wanted to go with a wheel that had a high amount of backspacing because I really wanted this thing to drive well. Wider axles come with these really heavy-duty Steer Smarts Yeti drag link and tie rod combo. This stuff is massive. It works really well. The 1550 knuckles keeps the axle, or keeps the tie rod super high and tucked out of the way. And I really wanted to see, could I get away with driving this thing without hydraulic assist? And so I knew the best way to do that is get the best scrub radius I could. So I went with this wide axle with a high numerical backspacing. And I'll tell you right now, initially, it is pretty darn awesome. I've been wheeling with it. I've been driving it a lot every day, and I'm very happy with it. Gonna go into more detail on everything about how this thing really wheels, what I've learned about it wheeling with these big axles, how the brakes feel, and all that stuff in our next video. I appreciate you guys holding on to the end and seeing just where this thing came to be. I've got a lot more coming for this Gladiator, so please do me a favor, like, subscribe, let me know what you guys are thinking of the project in the comments below. I appreciate you guys, and hopefully everyone is staying safe, and we'll be talking to you soon. Take care.